As has been our tradition over the past few years, I've asked the subspecialty team director in the subspecialty of the award recipient to introduce the awardee. So Jinru Xia is the director of GI pathology, and she will introduce Dr. Hruban.
Thank you, David. And it really is a great pleasure and a tremendous honor to introduce this year's Stewart Award recipient, Dr. Ralph Hruban. So I am going to start with this. So right from our famous wall, and here is Dr. Hruban. So really a fitting celebratory occasion. Dr. Hruban is not only our awardee, but also one of us and an alumnus. So before MSK, Dr. Hruban was at the Johns Hopkins. He did his MD there, got his pathology residency there, and Hopkins really attracted him. So after MSK, he went back there and has been there since. So at the Hopkins, Dr. Hruban rose through the ranks very quickly to become professor of pathology and also professor of oncology, and he served many important roles. And currently, Dr. Hruban is the director of the Saul Goldman Pancreatic Cancer Research Center, and he's also the director of their Department of Pathology and also pathologist in chief at the Johns Hopkins Hospital. So through Dr. Hruban's career, as we all have seen, Dr. Hruban has really remained a very passionate pancreas pathology investigator, educator, and passionate pancreas scientist. I noticed that you don't have that tie anymore. Yesterday we saw Dr. Hruban's tie having a pancreas on his tie. And so Dr. Hruban has made significant contributions to our understanding of all of these different types of pancreas tumors, familial forms included, and very significantly, his work on precursors has really had a profound impact in the field in all of those areas. And today, as we know, he is really one of the giants in the field of pancreas. I am going to skip a lot of things. I don't have enough time. David can add. I'll just jump to this still only selected list of awards that Dr. Hruban has earned as testament to his great achievements. No time for details, but as we can see here, each award is really tremendous, right? Carries with it highly, highly prestigious recognition. Just a word about this particular one. You know, when you deal with something as bad, as complex and malignant as pancreas cancer, it takes a lot. And Dr. Hruban seems to know where the secret is, where to find a lot. And his work has really shown us the power of team science. That's the secret. Team science in cancer research. So by gathering the concerted efforts from a team of really distinguished scientists, as we see here, here's Vogelstein, they are able to achieve all of these wonderful new discoveries. I hope you can read here. So again, here playing a leading role is Dr. Hruban. And here's another leader, we know who that is. And here is Dr. Yacobuzia, who just gave us a wonderful talk on pancreas. So no surprise, they were the recipients of this very prestigious AACR award. And now, to all of these awards, I should also add that Dr. Hruban has more than 723 scientific papers, and he has been recognized as the most cited pancreas scientist in the world, really. And I know I don't have a lot of time, but I should also mention that Dr. Hruban is also a great educator. Aside from all the fellows residents he trained, he has written many books and more than 150 review articles and book chapters. And here is a book of his that we're all very familiar with, very high impactful. And I should also add another significant contribution by Dr. Hruban is all of these wonderful, really cool educational materials that he puts out through digital media. And then there's the very interesting documentary and related things. I have a hunch. You said your talk will not be on pancreas. Maybe it'll be on these things. Looking forward to that. I think it can be said all of these great achievements, they are rooted in a lot of things, but one of the things is Dr. Hruban's deep knowledge in traditional surgical pathology, histology. It's the very innovative integration of histology, pathology with those cutting-edge molecular and digital technologies that allowed all the contributions. So in this fashion, I think Dr. Hruban's achievements really pay homage to the legacy of this man, Dr. Stewart, a traditional surgical pathologist, and in this way, this award is really well-deserved award on Dr. Hruban. Congratulations.
Thanks. You can, yeah. At this point, I have the honor of actually presenting the award that I hope is still here. Oh yeah, didn't walk off. But I'd just like to beg your forbearance for a few more minutes, because in this particular case, obviously, I have a very long and close relationship with the award winner. I was trying to think as I was sitting here this morning when Ralph and I first started to interact, and I kind of think it goes back to that Annapolis meeting, and actually Mira and I drove down to Annapolis in my car that had been vandalized the night before, and so we weren't entirely sure if we were going to make it, but it was some NCI-sponsored think tank to define priorities for research in pancreas cancer. And you know, at the time, I think there were maybe 3 pathologists in the country interested in pancreas cancer, and most of them were doing carcinogen-based mouse modeling. And you know, this was really at the early time, and you know, going back to that time, Ralph and I have had a long-standing collaboration and friendship, and you know, I can really tell you that this is one of the most generous collaborators you'll find. He's mentored so many young people, brought in different groups to work together, shared his knowledge, his material, his experiences. As you heard from Jinru, he's also a Renaissance man and has been involved in many different aspects of medical education and medical history. I'm a little nervous about his talk because he refused to tell me what it is. It's entitled The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and I was afraid it was a profile of the memorial faculty. But in any event, the only thing is I have one confession to make, is that I didn't vote for you. I'm the chair, I don't vote. But I was truly delighted when the faculty selected you as the Stewart Award winner, and I couldn't wait to make that phone call. And so I'm just thrilled to present this award. Come on. Take the plastic off. One more. Great. Don't lose it.
Thank you both. It's such an honor to be here. And for me, and we were talking about this at dinner last night, Memorial is family. And I love Memorial, and I love my Memorial family. And thinking about it last night, how Memorial feels like family, I kind of reflected on my path to come to Memorial as a fellow. And I was a resident at Hopkins in surgical pathology, and Joe Eggleston called me into his office, which always makes one nervous. And he said, "Ralph, I want you to go to Memorial." And I said, "Yes, sir." And then my next question, "Where's Memorial?" And he said, "New York." And I'm not even sure I applied. I think in those days, Hopkins and Memorial, we remained so wonderfully close. You know, Joe just picked up the phone and probably called someone and said, "I'm sending someone up." And then about a week before I was to come up to Memorial, Joe called me in his office again, and he said, "Ralph, I want to warn you, the guys at Memorial are hot dogs, and you have to be careful." And he tells me the story of a patient who had a granular cell tumor of the larynx that had been biopsied at Memorial, called cancer, and then the patient had a laryngectomy. And he said, "Be careful when you're up there. These guys will call anything cancer." And so I go up, and we're up there, I think it's the first day, and you know, I think there were 12 fellows, and Phil Lieberman points at me and says, Uncle Phil said, "Come, he sat me in his office, and he said, you know, I don't know, Ralph, you guys at Hopkins are all hot dogs. And he said, there's this case of a granular cell tumor of the larynx that you guys call cancer, and it was taken out. And he said, you know, be careful at Hopkins. And so right away, I knew there was a wonderful special relationship between the two institutions. And then at the end of my first week, again, Uncle Phil calls me in his office, and I was cutting. I think it was like 4 in the afternoon on a Friday. And he sits me down, and he pulls out a bottle of scotch, and he puts it on the table and says, you know, have a drink. And so here I am. He's like, okay, they think the guys from Hopkins are hot dogs. He wants me to drink while I'm cutting. And I thought it was a trick. You know, so I said, no, I don't drink. And then, of course, Sternberg came in, and everyone, and little did I realize this was a tradition every Friday afternoon to have this wonderful scotch in his office and celebrate friendship and stories. And 2 weeks later, so now it's Myron Malamed was the chair, a fantastic chair at the time, and he had a picnic kind of thing at his house. And we were told, and I think it may have been Mark, said, it's very casual. Come in your shorts and a T-shirt. And so, you know, we come there with our Frisbees, and it was a little bit more formal than that. But we had a great time, and we're driving home, and our spouses, our wives are saying, you know, Vincent DeVita is such a nice guy. He's so funny. And we're all like, Vincent DeVita wasn't there. And we were trying to figure out who the heck was Vincent DeVita. And so it turns out Steve Sternberg went to all the spouses and pretended to be Vincent DeVita and would tell these jokes and stories. So from there, you can't help but it's like family where you're joking with your, you know, playing pranks on your family members, joking with them, not afraid to tell them their idea's stupid. And from the day I set foot at Memorial, I fell in love with the place. I still love it, and it's still such a wonderful family for me. So it's a real honor to get this award. Now I'm going to try and play an audio. Let's see if this works. See if people, you guys are too young. This is the audio from the movie The Good, Bad, and the Ugly, and I thought I would play that. I have no financial disclosures, and obviously I'm labeling people as good, bad, and ugly, and you know, you can't debate matters of taste, so there shouldn't be any questions or concerns about that. So it's looking at Stewart, you see someone who clearly is a good person, right? He's got his feet up, he's typing his own path reports, and obviously an extraordinary diagnostician and great person. And the history of Hopkins and Memorial, the relationship, really goes back to this guy here, who's William Shelley. And William Shelley was a fellow here in the late 50s. And he and Fred Stewart developed an extraordinary friendship. And in fact, Fred Stewart would come down to Hopkins and spend a week every year after Bill Shelley came back. And he would live in the dome, and this is the old dome before they cleaned it. It's all nice and sooty. And spend a week in Hopkins, and the residents and everyone would bring interesting cases, and Bill Shelley and Stewart would talk about them. And so here's John Boitnott, who is still active at Hopkins, our liver pathologist, and he was chief resident one of the years that Stewart came. And so he brought him a case. Now, I don't have a photograph of the actual slide he brought him, but I do have a drawing of it. And this is the slide he brought, and it was from a patient. Clinically, the question was, is it tuberculosis, because the patient had lymphadenopathy, lymphoma, or Hodgkins disease? And so they had this, John has a wonderful remembrance of this great discussion that Bill Shelley and Stewart had. Is it tuberculosis? Is it Hodgkins? Is it tuberculosis and/or Hodgkins? And in fact, this is the kid, the picture from the kid that it's from, and you can recognize the classic Reed-Sternberg cell. So they, after having a lot of fun talking, and the reason in particular is because Sternberg, who was an Austrian pathologist, thought that Hodgkins was tuberculosis, a form of it. So the case was Hodgkin's disease, And then they got into argument, should it be Sternberg-Reed or Reed-Sternberg cell? And this is the stuff you love in surgical pathology. And in fact, the description of the cell and the separation of tuberculosis from Hodgkin's disease, here's the reading from the original. At the age of 28, she carefully studied the disease. She recorded the results of TB skin tests, tumor size. She repeated Sternberg's experiments. Remember, he thought it was tuberculosis, inoculating rabbits and guinea pigs with lymph nodes from patients with Hodgkin's disease, and could show no connection. And so she wrote, I cannot understand this conception of the tubercle bacillus, which suggests it is the cause of such a growth. I have little difficulty distinguishing these two processes. And of course, this was Dorothy Reed. And Dorothy Reed was a fellow at Hopkins at the age of 28 when she made this distinction and description of the cells. And so it's the Reed-Sternberg cell was the conclusion that they came to. And what's quite remarkable is the case that John Boitnott showed to Fred Stewart was Dorothy Reed's original case. He went to the file, pulled it out, and here you can see the drawing actually is in her own hand in the description of her paper. So this is the kind of fun that people had and that Stewart had, and represents, I think, what's fun of pathology, is taking the time, finding that original case, and then the wonderful discussions that ensue. So these guys are clearly good guys, good people. And so in thinking of what I wanted to talk about this afternoon, or this morning, I guess it's afternoon, no, morning still, is what it means to be a good collaborator, a good person in medicine, why being bad is bad, and hopefully give you some thoughts about that. So that's where I came up with the idea of the good, the bad, and the ugly. So the good, I want to give an example of good dedication to medicine that fundamentally has impact. And every day in the hall at Hopkins, I pass this plaque that's on the right. And when you read it, and I passed it for decades before I actually read it, and I can read the bottom of it here: with more than the courage and devotion of the soldier, he risked and lost his life to show how a fearful pestilence is communicated and how its ravages may be prevented. And this is Jesse Lazear. And so this piqued my interest. This clearly was, just as Fred Stewart was a good man, so clearly was Jesse. And Jesse studied yellow fever, and I think it's very appropriate now because, as you know, yellow fever is very closely related to Zika virus. It's an acute viral hemorrhagic disease, and the patients die just a terrible death with jaundice, abdominal pain, and vomiting. It is an awful way to die. And this disease ravaged the United States for decades. And in 1702 here in New York, 10% of the population of New York died from yellow fever. In 1793, again, 1/10 of Philadelphia's population died. And women were known to abandon their children if they feared that their child had it. And here's a picture of a patient suffering the ravages of this disease. Going back to Philadelphia, Benjamin Rush thought that it was caused by poisons escaping from foul piles of coffee in the wharf. They had various things where they would shoot cannons to scare it off. He advocated aggressive bleeding for this hemorrhagic disease. And I love this quotation: Rush had made one of the great discoveries which had contributed to the depopulation of the earth with his therapeutic bleeding. But then the United States is, well, there's an attempt first by the French to build the Panama Canal, and they stopped because so many of the workers have died. The French abandoned the effort, and then the United States is called to Cuba and to Panama to try and address the yellow fever epidemic. And so they turned to this man, who's William Welsh, who was the first chairman of pathology at Hopkins, who at the time was kind of the father of medicine in the United States, and asked him to assemble a team. And again, it was the team that was critical for this success in the war against yellow fever to fight the disease. So one of the first people he chose was George Sternberg. Sternberg was the Surgeon General of the U.S. Army, and in those times, I guess the Surgeon General really dressed up. He had done a fellowship in bacteriology at Hopkins. Next was Walter Reed, and I think everyone's familiar with the Walter Reed Medical Center. An amazing man, born in 1851. And I love the story where his father couldn't afford to send him to college, so sent him to medical school instead. But Walter Reed graduates, one of the youngest students ever at UVA. He, obviously a good, generous man, in his travels out west, even adopted a Native American who was an orphan. And he also spent time with William Welsh at Hopkins, and so that's why Welsh chose him to be part of the team. Jesse Lazear was a Hopkins undergraduate and was head of the pathology clinical labs. And again, Welsh knew him as a brilliant microbiologist, and so selected him to go down. And finally, Aristides Agramonte, shown here, was the last one. He did not have a connection with Hopkins. So these four were assigned to go down to Cuba and fight yellow fever. And here's Jesse in Cuba. So first they showed that yellow fever is not a bacteria. There was a theory at the time that yellow fever was caused by a bacteria, and they were able to disprove this. Then they were interested in how is it transmitted. And they turned to the work of this guy, Henry Carter. And Henry Carter, again, went into medicine because a leg injury made it hard for him to be an engineer. And you can tell you the status of medicine at the time. And he showed that yellow fever had an extrinsic incubation period of 12 days. So it was 12 days between one case and the next, and the people could, in fact, be separated. So they decided, this group of physicians, and again, the story here is the people dedicated to medicine, just as you guys are dedicated to the fight against cancer. And they were all in, if you will. They decided they would capture mosquitoes that had bitten people on the ward, and then wait 12 days, and then allow that mosquito to bite a healthy volunteer. And to quote from them, "The serious nature of the work decided upon and the risk entailed upon it were fully considered, and we all agreed as the best justification we could offer for experimentation upon others to submit to the same risk of inoculation ourselves." So not only did they get volunteers, they decided that they themselves would be part of the study. So again, they would capture the birds, as they called them, in the hospital, allow them to feed on patients who had yellow fever. They called it loading. And the first person to volunteer is Carroll, and he gets sick with yellow fever, but he had been in contact with patients with yellow fever, and so they couldn't rule out direct transmission of the disease. The second one was Jesse. And Jesse wrote to his wife here, and I hope you can read it. I think I am on the track of the real germ, he writes here to his wife. So September 8th, he writes this note home. I think I know how it's transmitted. He develops the disease and sadly dies of it at the age of 34. So he was able to show the transmission from the mosquito to him, and he leaves behind an orphan daughter at Hopkins. And this is the cable message sent to his wife. Dr. Lazear died at 8 this morning from his disease. And in fact, if you go back to his notebook, he documents that, in fact, he was the patient. He documents his own death, if you will, describing when he was bitten and his eventual death. Well, this was obviously upset a lot of people. Walter Reed actually wasn't in Cuba at the time. He was kind of advising on the studies at a distance. So he came down to Havana. They name the camp Camp Lazear, and they get volunteers from the area. They pay them $100 to participate, another $100 if they get infected. And in fact, this was the first written consent that was obtained. And you can see here the consent that the individuals had to sign, and saying if they left before the study was done, they would lose their $100. So the study wasn't easy. Here's a description. When the fourth case was carried out of the camp to the hospital, it caused a veritable panic among the remaining Spaniards. The volunteers seeing patients coming down with the disease, and I think several who died. And as Major Reed aptly put it, they lost all interest in the progress of science and severed their connection with Camp Lazear. In all, 18 people were infected. To disprove the fomite theory, that it was, there was a theory, as I mentioned, that the disease was transmitted through waste material. They took bedding, sheets, blankets, and pillowcases, and soiled it with, I love this, liberal quantities of black vomit, urine, and fecal material. And the volunteers stayed there for 20 days. And these were little tiny huts that they stayed in. Can you imagine staying for 20 days in something like these things with a room filled with black vomit, urine, and fecal material? It was quite an adventure. But they do identify the virus as the etiology of yellow fever. They then can control it by putting kerosene on standing water so the mosquito can't breed. And there was not a single case of yellow fever in Havana from September 1st to July 1902. And I love this letter from Walter Reed to Jessie Lazear's widow. He was a splendid, brave fellow. I lament his loss more than words can tell, but his death was not in vain. His name will live in the history of those who have beautified humanity. And to me, when I think of good people in medicine, I think first of Jesse and his contributions, and even have visited his grave. But as we move forward, I think there's a lesson for us, and I think Fred Stewart also represented that in some ways, of a dedication to fighting human suffering and putting it in the larger perspective. Now, getting on to the bad, and no, David, I have no one here. As try as I might, the only bad I could find was at Harvard. And so it always comes to that. So this is a story from Harvard. And I think it illustrates the opposite of when people don't work together, but rather try to work for fame and personal benefit, and the harm that can cause to themselves and to others. So it's 1846 is the date. Does anyone know why this date is so important? It's Ether Day, the day ether was introduced as general anesthesia. So before anesthesia, if you can imagine how things were done, it was horrific, right? It was grab the patient, hold them down, and do the surgery as fast as you could while they screamed. And here's one description. On September 23rd, 1833, I removed the whole of his left eyeball with its lacrimal gland and divided the optic nerve as far back as in a socket. Such was the patient's extreme fortitude and perseverance that not even his hand raised nor a civil complaint uttered during the operation. It's hard to imagine that. But the reality, again, was that these were horrific operations. And here's one from the Mass General. The patient came quaking, took one look at the operating room, and bolted down the hall, locking himself in the bathroom, screaming the whole time. The surgeon gave chase, broke down the door, captured the patient by the neck, dragged him under the arm to the operating theater, and did the surgery. And so the tools that were used were these blunt tools designed simply for speed, to make the surgery faster, with one cut, the curved knife. But at the same time, and this is quite remarkable, and I think this highlights why it's so important to read the literature, read the literature, read the literature. 4 blocks away, while this horrific surgery is being done, on the Broadway Tabernacle Theater here in New York, 4,000 people are howling with laughter at the antics of people on stage who had inhaled nitric oxide gas. So nitric oxide is available. It's used to make fun of people on stage and for entertainment purposes. And in fact, nitric oxide was discovered by the Unitarian minister, Joseph Priestley. He discovered oxygen in 1771 and then prepared a nitrous oxide and he had an unusual name for it, dephlogisated nitrous air, in 1772. So in 1772, nitric oxide was available, and it wasn't used for another 70 years because people didn't bother to read. He didn't recognize its anesthetic effect, but believed that it would have great applications in medicine. So now we're fast forwarding 70 years, and this dentist, Gardner Colton, comes to Hartford, actually it's Colton, I think, invented the Colt gun, but a dentist, Horace Wells, takes a turn on stage and makes a fool of himself by inhaling nitrous oxide and then doing silly things. He gets off a stage, and on the way back, he bumps into a ledge and badly cuts his leg. And he doesn't feel it, but his wife says, Horace, look at your leg, you're bleeding. And he realizes that nitric oxide could be used for painless surgery. And as a dentist, he of course, thinks of tooth extraction. So here he has a tooth extracted under nitric oxide anesthesia. Here you can see the bag of anesthesia. And so he contacts his friend, another dentist, William Morton, and they contact the surgeon at the Mass General, John Warren. And John Warren was part of a long family of surgeons who worked at the Mass General. And they go to the now famous ether dome with a bag of nitric oxide. They give it to a medical student, and I think they extract a tooth or do some surgery on him. He cries out, and the audience yells, "Humbug, boo," and Wells is disgraced. But in retrospect, or after the fact, the patient said that he didn't feel any pain. He was just surprised to see his tooth out in the dentist's hand. And so nitric oxide is available, but the first experiment on nitric oxide, if you will, fails miserably. Now, ether, the other anesthetic, again, around for centuries, right? But people didn't bother to read the literature. And I won't try and pronounce his name, but I think it's rather simple. We can call him the Prince of Philosophy and Medicine. I love that title. We should give that out in academic centers. So he develops ether, again, long, many centuries, 3 centuries before it was actually ever used. And he noted chickens will eat it, whereupon they sleep for a moderately long time, and when they wake up without injury. But again, the only use is for these ether parties. And for people to make make fools of themselves and entertain their friends. I love this guy in the background. I don't know what he's doing. he's enjoying the ether, I guess. And so now the other dentist, William Morton, who was a real charlatan, a swindler. He went from town to town passing bad checks, phantom entries into books and others. And so here's a description of him from Bates in Cincinnati. The cunning, unscrupulousness, and boldness with which he carried out his operations marked his career as being without parallel among the swindlers who from time to time have infected our city. And Morton's ignorance of matters of general knowledge was a subject of common remark. And if he is not as bad as represented, all who know him here have entirely mistaken his character. So he was a bad guy, right? He's a swindler, a charlatan. But he recognizes that ether could be used as anesthesia. And but since ether is 3 centuries old, it can't be patented. He tries to hide what it is. He adds lemon and oranges and things to it. He then approaches the surgeon, Charles Jackson, and says, let's try this out. John Warren, and they decide to operate on a cystic neoplasm of the neck of a young man. And here's the famous drawing of it. The surgeon operates and then turns to the audience and says, gentlemen, this is no humbug. So now, in October 1846, general anesthesia begins and makes surgery that's done here every day possible. The acceptance is stochastic at best. It spreads quickly in Europe. And I love this. This Yankee Dodge gentleman beats mesmerism hollow. I'd love to have that written about one of my papers. Beats mesmerism hollow. The Lancet publishes a number of pages. Unfortunately, in the United States, even though it was introduced here, acceptance is very slow. And it took over a year for it even to be first used in Philadelphia. I think they didn't trust New Yorkers. And others reject it for religious grounds. It's a decoy of Satan. It will harden society and rob God of the deep and earnest cries which arise in time of trouble for help. So the screaming, some people felt, was a good thing. The third person in this is a chemist at Harvard, and who the other two dentists had spoken to. He claims that he gave Morse the idea for the telegraph, and after the demonstration of ether, Jackson, the chemist, claims that it was all his idea as well. So there's a fight over the patent, but remember, this is stuff that can't be patented. But the people at the Mass General, the administration, in cahoots with Morton and Jackson, decide to patent ether. They changed the name to Lithion to hide the fact that what they were using was not patentable. And Oliver Wendell Holmes comes up with the idea for anesthesia, for the Greek for insensible. Morton makes a deal such that anyone who wanted to have an operation would have to come to the Mass General and pay a higher fee. But they quickly start fighting for credit. The U.S. House of Representatives adds to the fight by giving an award to whoever actually gets credit for it. So now there's $100,000 on the patent at stake. And so these guys start fighting with each other. Horace Wells, now remember, he's the guy with nitric oxide. And so the lesson here is, they're in medicine for the wrong reason. They're not trying to fight human suffering. They're trying to enrich themselves. And so let's see what happens to them. So Horace Wells, the one who introduced nitric oxide, in 1847, chloroform is introduced, and he becomes a chloroform addict. He's in Europe. He comes back to New York, and in January of 1848 throws acid on a prostitute. He's put in jail, and in jail someone sneaks him chloroform and a razor, and he commits suicide and dies at the age of 33. Morton, again, the real charlatan here, who, I love this, so many flaws and one lacking a sense of ethics and decency, was one of the bitter ironies of history that he should have made this discovery. But again, he's in it for the wrong reason and bad things happen. There's an article written in Atlantic Monthly giving credit to the chemist, Jackson. Morton reads it while being driven through Central Park, becomes agitated, and then runs wildly into a pond in Central Park, plunges his head into the water, and presumably has a stroke, cerebral hemorrhage. And so he dies in this fit of rage. I guess I imagine his blood pressure went up and he dies. And so his tombstone ironically reads, inventor and revealer of inhalation anesthesia, before whom in all time surgery was agony, by whom pain in surgery was averted and annulled, since whom science has control of pain. Well, the last surviving member is the chemist, Jackson. And the story is he went to the grave of Morton, saw that written on his tombstone, and never said another word in his life. He became catatonic. Other people think he had a stroke in his study, but regardless, he doesn't speak for years, and in fact is put into an insane asylum, McLean, survives 7 years and dies in 1880. So here are these guys who are in medicine for the wrong reason, and they end terrible, sad deaths. The irony of it all is that, in fact, they weren't the first to use ether in anesthesia. It goes to Crawford Long, who many of you know the Crawford Long Hospital in Atlanta. And Crawford Long, this is a posed picture. He's here. He's not actually doing surgery on this gentleman. He used ether 4 years before they did to remove a tumor from a boy. And while all this fighting was going on, the friends of Crawford Long said, why don't you go up to New York, try and get credit, get that 100,000. He said, no, what I love to do is deliver babies, and I want to be down here and deliver babies. So he dies at the age of 62, and how does he die? Well, he's there, he's assisting a woman to give birth, he delivers the baby, hands it to the dad, and then falls over dead. So something wonderful, a way to die for someone who's had the right priorities. So if you go now in Boston, you can see the ether monument, neither shall there be any more pain. But for me, obviously that's critically important, allows us to do what we do, but the story behind it, I think, has lessons for all of us today in how we act in medicine. All right, the ugly, and now you knew this was coming, right? So the good, the bad, and the ugly. Well, here's, here's the pathology group, and you can see what relaxed people we are with our arms like that. I don't know what we were doing, but a motley group. What they say, a face only a mother could love. But again, it's not how you look that makes you beautiful. It's the way you act, the way you think, and the way you act. And so, as I think about the ugly, to me, how you act is about how can we be better physicians? How can we be the best physicians possible? And of course, and thinking about being a physician, there's only the leader of all this, the man who started it all in the Western Hemisphere, Sir William Osler, and the lessons he teaches us about the philosophy of medicine. So Osler is born in the countryside outside of Toronto, Muddy York as it was called, in 1849. He studies at McGill, and he's first appointed to be a pathologist to the hospital in 1876. And he, in fact, himself performed over 1,000 autopsies. So he could see his patient on the wards, follow the patient would die, and then he would do the autopsy. And highlighting the importance for us of knowing the clinical information and the power that one can get when you integrate clinical information with pathology. So he would compare clinical diagnoses with findings at autopsy, and that's what made him a great and extraordinary clinician. And so here he is in the top hat doing an autopsy on 2 different individuals, and you can see they did them with their bare hands. And in fact, he contracted tuberculosis of his hands doing this. And he famously said, as is our pathology, so is our practice. Osler gave a number of talks and wrote a book on a way of life for medicine. And to me, this is what should guide us as we go forward. And Osler, for instance, said he desired no epitaph other than the statement that he taught medical students on the wards. And here he is at a patient's bedside teaching students and residents. And so when I think of our pancreas group, I think of them as extraordinary educators who love to teach. And here you can see some of them, Günter Kloppel, here's Vulcan, and Giuseppe Zamboni. And you can just, from the posture of these, my colleagues, you can see how teaching is so integral to what we do. But it wasn't just teaching, lecture teaching like this that Osler thought was so important. It was bedside teaching. The best book in medicine is the book of nature, as written large in the bodies of man. You remember the answer of the immortal Hunter, and Hunter was the famous surgeon. There's a book written about him called Knife Man. When asked what books the student should read in anatomy, he opened the doors of the dissecting room and pointed to the tables. So it's not just teaching in a lecture hall, but rather the teaching at the scope that I think is, for pathologists, so critical. It's that intimate relationship between the teacher and the student, and where the teaching and then the questioning back is so wonderful. So again, here's Vulcan and David, and I love that picture because it's at the scope teaching. Osler, in addition to bedside teaching, spoke of the power and the value of lifelong learning. And so he said in his speech at McGill in 1899 the great fundamental principle laid down by Plato that education is a lifelong process in which the student can only make a beginning during his college course. To cover the vast field of medicine in 4 years is an impossible task. We can only instill principles, but put the student on the right path, give him methods, teach him how to study, and early to discern between essentials and non-essentials. And there are obviously many points to the lifelong learning and then discerning between essentials and non-essentials. And as a physician scientist, trying to decide what's interesting and what's important, a critical distinction in guiding what scientific path to take. And so again, my colleagues in the pancreas field constantly learning, constantly studying, not just sitting on their laurels, but learning is a lifelong process, making them great pancreas pathologists. Whoop, go back, I think I skipped one. And so one of the people I admire most is my collaborator, Bert Vogelstein, and he's just a great example of the power of lifelong learning. And he said, this is from an email, excerpted from an email he sent me, and the next page I'll show you the journals he reads every week. And he said, I go through the titles looking for what's new about the study, whether it interests me, and most importantly, whether I know how they obtain their results. Technically, I read the abstract. If it's not evident from the title, then he reads evident, then he goes deeper and deeper, starting with the figures. He also searches, and you can now get these automatically. 500 terms of interest to me. Just an amazing, I get pancreatic cancer emailed to me. That's my term. He said he used to read 14 hours a week, but he said he's become much more efficient. And so he tells me he just reads 6 to 8 hours every Saturday. So here's one of the most famous scientists in the world, and he spends his entire day Saturday reading. And I think for us, that's a great, whether you're practicing pathology or an investigator, reading throughout one's life is so critical. And these are the journals that Bert reads, and I think it's just an amazing, and the list went on, to read these every week and the dedication that takes, but the payoff is big, and the payoff most importantly for our patients. And for me, one of the most fun in collaborative and team efforts is learning together. And so here I'm with Günter Kloppel and Johann Offerhaus, and you can see we're looking at a screen, learning something together. And what a fun that is to learn something new with people you admire and your colleagues. Equanimity, another critical thing that Osler taught. And in fact, the Osler ties at Hopkins have equanimitas written on them. And the first quality needed in an effective physician is the physical state of imperturbability. And that imperturbability is something you're born with. You don't have a choice about it. Coolness and presence of mind under all circumstances, calmness amid a storm, clearness of judgment in the moments of grave peril, immobility, impassiveness. And obviously, when things go terribly wrong in medicine, you need to have imperturbability. The second quality needed is equanimity, the mental equivalent of the body endowment of imperturbability. And this you can cultivate in yourself. This, Osler argued, we can change. So cultivate a measure of equanimity as would enable me to bear success with humility, the affection of my friends without pride, and to be ready when the day of sorrow and grief come. And you need this in pathology, right? You need it because there's going to be enormous piles of slides to look at with tight time pressure, or the frozen section diagnosis with the surgeon yelling down your neck. And so equanimity is something that's so critical to withstand and move forward during these difficult times. And one of my favorite quotations on equanimity is from the movie Men in Black, where he was running around saying, oh my God, the world's going to end, there's a Darkulian battleship. And Zed says, there always is an Arculian battle cruiser about to destroy the planet. And that's true in medicine, where they're always, every day expect it, there's going to be these emergencies, and it's how you respond with equanimity that Osler argued matters. Consume your own smoke. is another one, which I just think is apt as ever. And as department chair, I'm sure, Dave, you feel this. You wish you could say that to people when they come in the office. Learn to consume your own smoke. The atmosphere of life is darkened with the murmurings and whimperings of men and women over the non-essentials, the trifles that are inevitably incident to the hurly-burly of the day's routine. Learn to accept in silence the minor aggravations, cultivate the gift of taciturnity, and consume your own smoke with an extra draught of hard work so that those around you may not be annoyed with the dust and soot of your complaints. And I can tell you in my workings with my colleagues in pathology, they're so pleasant and so nice. I know people must be aggravated with things, why did Ralph ask me that stupid question or something? But instead, the attitude and the sharing is just wonderful. People are consuming their own smoke and smiling. Respect for others, another critical one. Many physicians whose daily work is a daily round of beneficence will say hard things and think hard thoughts of a colleague. No sin will so easily beset you as uncharitableness towards your brother practitioner. So strong is the personal element in the practice of medicine, and so many are the wagging tongues in every parish that evil speaking, lying, and slandering find a shining mark in the lapses and mistakes which are inevitable to our work. 2 plain rules. From the day you begin practice, never under any circumstances listen to a tale told to the detriment of a brother practitioner. And when any dispute or trouble does arise, go frankly ere sunset and talk the matter over, in which way you may gain a brother and a friend. And so as Osler, quoting John Locke, said, live life the best you can, but live it so as not to give needless offense to others. Do all you can to avoid the vices, follies, and weaknesses of your neighbors, but take no needless offense at their divergences from your ideal. Another way is to, see no evil, speak no evil, hear no evil. And I think this is very hard to do. People come up to you and will say gossipy something, and right away, by its nature, it's interesting. And instead, just say, no, if it's true, go talk to the person before sunset. One I love is work, and I think people often will come to me, Junior, and say, can you give me a project? And it's instead of doing the background reading that Bert does or the hard work. Osler famously said in a speech to the University of Toronto in 1903, I propose to tell you the secret of life as I have seen the game played and as I have tried to play it myself. Though as a little one, the master word looms large in meaning. It is the open sesame to every portal, the great equalizer in the world, the true philosopher's stone, which transmutes all the bare metal of humanity into gold. The stupid man among you it will make bright, the bright man brilliant, and the brilliant student. And the master word is work. A little one, as I have said, but fraught with momentous consequences if you can write it on the tables of your heart and bind it upon your foreheads. And I think, in medicine, nothing succeeds like more than hard work. And to give you some examples from my colleagues, John Cameron, who just turned 80 on the 29th of September and did a Whipple the following week as a surgeon, he told me 7 days a week he arrives in his Blaylock building office before 6:30. So this is the age of 80. Weekdays, he gets there at 5:30 a.m. After a break for dinner, he works until about 9 p.m. when a resident calls him at home to discuss his patients. So this guy works not only long every day, but long career. And my dear colleague and friend, Scott Kern, I think is a great example of that. We went to, I think it was Utah or Salt Lake City, and we decided we were going to share a room, which before you share a room with someone, ask them about their sleeping habits. I tell you. So, and we're there, and it's a conference, and there's a dinner with wine and everything the night, and then like 4 in the morning, the lights come on in the room, and Scott's reading. So I'm like, Scott, what are you doing? And he said, no, it's, I get up every day at 4 and I work and I read. So if before you room with someone, ask about it. But what a tireless worker Scott is. But of course, having fun is a critical part. You know, all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy, and here you can see the greats at Memorial having a lot of fun. I presume this was not in the hospital, but somewhere else, although it does look awfully like the library did. You know, my colleagues, here's Dave with Zamboni having, you know, knowing how to enjoy themselves. We've had dinners, and this is in Japan, where we had a meeting on precursor lesions, and afterwards, I think it was a game of charades, or I hope it was, and people weren't just standing up and doing these things for fun. Clearly, enjoying life is such a critical part of it. And here's Chris. That's my wife, Claire, and I don't know what they were dancing to, but they were having a nice time. So the end is here, and I just wanted to leave with a sentiment. I have absolutely enjoyed every minute that I've been working in pancreatic cancer, and I've enjoyed it because of the friends and colleagues, many of whom are here in the audience. And it's been such a pleasure. I've just put a couple of the people I enjoy working with up here, and there are many, many more. But all of them, to me, have many of the values that Osler highlighted, and none of the values of the guys with ether. So to finish, I thought I would end with a quotation from Osler, and these are my sincere wishes for all of you. There should be for each of you a busy, useful, and happy life, more you cannot expect, a greater blessing the world cannot bestow. Thank you very much, and thank you especially for this.